Hey, welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit more about data types. We're going to introduce a couple more data types, and we're going to see about creating some variables of those types in our project. We're then going to initialize those variables with values, and then we'll see what Visual Studio says to us when we don't use variables that we create in our program. Let's go ahead and get started. Thus far, we've learned about integers, which are whole numbers, but the truth is that not everything can be represented by a whole number. Sometimes we might need that fractional part. We refer to values that have a fractional part as floating point numbers. The two most popular types of floating point numbers are the float and the double. Both are capable of holding a number that has a fractional part, but one of these takes up more memory and can hold more information. Can you guess which one? That's right, it's the double. A float value is capable of holding 6 to 7 digits. Therefore, it has less precision than a double, and it takes up less memory. A double, on the other hand, can hold 15 to 16 digits, and thus has more precision and requires more memory. Now, if you don't need high precision, or you're trying to conserve memory, use a float. But if you really need a lot of digits and you're willing to use more memory to store that information, go with a double. Some types are more limited in the values that they can hold. The Boolean type has only two choices for the values it can hold. Those choices are true or false. Booleans are used to make decisions in our code. Now the type keyword for Boolean is bool. So if you create a variable that has the type bool, you can only store the value of true or the value of false in that variable. Now here's a challenge. Let's go back into our program, and in our main function, let's create some variables. I want you to create a float variable called root beer and initialize root beer to a value of 1.99. Then I want you to create a variable called cheeseburger of type double and initialize cheeseburger to a value of 5.99. And finally, create a Boolean variable called should have lunch and initialize should have lunch to a value of true. Pause the video and get those variables made now. Okay, we're back here in Visual Studio and we're ready to create some variables. So I'm going to go up here to the main function just at the top and give myself a couple lines. And I'm going to create my float variable called root beer. So root underscore beer. And I'm going to go ahead and initialize this to a value of 1.99. Next, I'll go ahead and create my double. And I'm going to call this cheeseburger. And I'll give cheeseburger a value of 5.99. And finally, I'm going to create my Boolean variable. And I'm going to call this should have lunch. And I'll set this equal to a value of true. So we've now created three new variables of types float, double, and bool respectively, and we've initialized those variables to have values. Now notice that some of our variables have a yellow squiggly line underneath them. Now root beer has a yellow squiggly line. If I hover over it, I'll get a pop-up that says float root beer, unused variable root beer. It's telling me that I created this variable, but I never actually used it for anything in my code. Visual Studio Code finds it a bit alarming that I created a variable and never used it. It suspects that maybe I made a mistake, maybe I forgot to use it, or I didn't need to create it in the first place. So whenever we see a yellow squiggly line like this, we can hover over it and see what kind of message Visual Studio has for us. You'll see that cheeseburger has the same pop-up and should have lunch also has the same pop-up because we created all three of these variables and never once used them. That's why our integer width doesn't have that squiggly line because we actually used width by passing it into init window. Okay, so in summary, we learned about a few more data types. We learned that there are floating point data types, which can have a fractional part, unlike the integer, which can only hold a whole number. We learned about a couple different kinds of floating point types, namely the float and the double. We learned that the double can hold more information than the float and requires more memory. We learned about the Boolean type, which is a special type that can only hold one of two values, true or false, and that the Boolean has the keyword bool. We also learned that when we create variables in Visual Studio Code and then never actually use those variables in our program, Visual Studio Code will warn us about this by putting a yellow squiggly line under the variable in question, and when we hover over it, we get a pop-up that tells us that we never actually used that variable. So now we know a little bit more about types, which is going to come in handy in the videos to come as we continue creating our game. See you in the next video.